the last episode of New York at 50, we parted company with Fiona and I en route to JFK from downtown Brooklyn in the back of a taxi. In this, the last episode of New York at 50, I want to look back at our journey back to the UK on British Airways from JFK to London Heathrow and then back up to Glasgow. And as you can see from the title of this episode, I'm asking the question, is there such a thing as a one-star airline? Most of you who watch and follow Fiona and I on the Liv'n the Dream channel will know that we're incredibly loyal to British Airways, but after this particular journey back to Heathrow, we're wondering, is that loyalty coming to an end? I will of course allow you to make up your own mind on this particular one, so sit back, relax, and join Fiona and I as we're about to board at British Airways 777-200 from JFK bound for London Heathrow. For the near 30 years that I've been travelling between the UK and New York, I don't think Terminal 7 has ever had an upgrade. This is the home of British Airways, and to me it looks exactly the same as it did back in the early 90s. Fiona and I are both bronze members of the British Airways Executive Club, and that allows us to check in at the business class counters, and thank goodness, because the queue at economy looks simply horrendous. However, if I paid the near £5,000 that British Airways wanted for a business class ticket each for this particular trip, I would have been getting rather hacked off right now, because the queue at Club World check-in was just as bad. The only saving grace to our entire check-in experience at British Airways Terminal 7 at JFK was the very polite and extremely funny British Airways check-in agent. What I will say here is I've been reading that British Airways are planning to move their entire operation at JFK over to Terminal 8, but not until 2022. I don't know what you're doing, British Airways, but I have to admit this is not a good experience. I'm sure you will understand that I didn't film the TSA screening process, but what I will say here is it wasn't too bad. The line was only about 15 minutes long and we were through pretty quick. What I will say is that the TSA agent was very funny as well, very chatty, and even thanked me for coming to New York on my birthday. The main downside of not travelling business class, apart from the obvious, and certainly not being gold or silver anymore, is Fiona and I no longer have access to the British Airways lounge, so we're forced to sit in this horrible, crowded area by the gate. Again, times must be good for British Airways, because they had 4 or 5 wide-bodied jets leaving half an hour apart, all bound for London Heathrow, but clearly they don't seem able to spend a little bit of money on providing better seating, or even seating at all, because I was disgusted to see so many people having to sit on the floor while waiting on their flight back to London tonight. After all, British Airways are supposed to be a full-service airline, but it certainly didn't seem like that tonight. With so many British Airways wide-body jets with similar flight numbers leaving so close together, as you can imagine, it was simply chaos in the terminal. Made worse by the flight to Gatwick cancelled and our flight leaving half an hour late. I've got no idea what happened, but it just seemed that chaos ensued. Of course, being British Airways bronze members of the Executive Club, Fiona and I were able to board on the third group. I know what you're thinking here, and you're asking, Graham, why the hell did you book economy in the first place? Well, you're sort of right, but I wanted to do this on the cheap, and I wanted to see what it was like. And my God, it was pretty awful. Let me tell you that after 7 hours in this seat, my backside was hurting, my legs were sore, and I was glad to get off in London on Sunday morning. I have to admit that the departure out of JFK this evening was particularly spectacular. So for those of you who are interested, I will put an unedited and an uncut version of this particular takeoff at the end of the video after the credits. This was, without a doubt, the most uncomfortable aeroplane seat I've ever sat on. In the first part of this New York at 50 series, I did say that British Airways' pretty old and pretty pathetic product was saved by their cabin crew on the flight from London out to New York, well, not on the way back. Whoever this cabin attendant was, there was no place for him on British Airways, never mind any airline. He was extremely rude, certainly not happy to be at work, and chucked the food at us. Maybe he knew that he was chucking out probably the worst airline food I've ever tasted. It was marginally better than the food we got on our British Airways flight out to New York, but I mean marginally, it was pretty terrible.
Girl, you are my fire, only true desire. Swear I'm not a liar, you should dance with me. You should get to know me, kick it with the heart.
And as we cruised northeast along the eastern seaboard towards Nova Scotia, Fiona and I settled in for a pretty miserable night on board British Airways en route to London. And as sure as day follows night, along comes British Airways breakfast being chucked at us, and yes folks, I have absolutely no idea what this was, but I have to admit, it was pretty grim.
But baby, I'm here to watch you. There's just one thing you should know. Girl, you are my fire, only true desire. Swear I'm not a liar, you should dance with me. You should get to know me, kick it with the homies. Let go of your worries, you should dance with me.
I suppose I shouldn't complain, being a self-confessed ab geek, but I do have to wonder that British Airways multi-billion-pound home at London Heathrow's International Airport, and we end up on a remote stand. And I'm sure you can imagine that after 7 hours in the world's most uncomfortable aeroplane seat, the thought of having to get on a bus after deplaning 300 passengers was not very appealing this morning.
You're like a runaway, there's something about you I can't make you stay. Run away, run away. You're like a renegade, there's something about you.
I suppose I can forgive the crew for being pretty grumpy after 7 hours crossing the Atlantic overnight. I'm not sure I would be too happy this morning either. In fact, I wasn't. I sort of hoped that the first and business class passengers did not have to go through the indignity of this deplaning process into buses, but somehow I think they did. But after paying up to £10,000 for a premium ticket, I'm not sure I'd be too amused with British Airways right now.
Run away, please stay. I promise I'll never leave. Run away, run away. Don't run away from me. Run away, please stay. I promise I'll never leave. Another rainy day, another betrayal is why you'll never stay. Run away, run away. Oh, but you're so far away from understanding me that I won't be that way. Run away, run away. I know you've been searching for a needle within a haystack world. Baby, I promise you I'm different, I'm irreplaceable. Run away, run away. Don't run away from me. Run away, please stay.
I know these must seem like just first world problems and I'm continuing to moan here, but I have to admit Terminal 5 in the morning is a pretty miserable place to be. It's crowded, it's chaotic, and no one really knows where they're going. In fact, at one point I had to ask the authorities to stop the escalator or somebody was going to get hurt. It was that chaotic.
I'll never let you down. I'll never let you down. Hear that familiar sound.
After surviving the escalator incident, going through security, feeling totally tired and miserable, it was time to get a proper breakfast. And before you ask, no, that didn't include beer.
There's something about you that I can.
And after being fed and watered, and with time to kill, at an airport, what did that mean? And of course, for Fiona, it meant duty free.
Run away. Don't run away from me.
However, it wasn't long until our flight was ready to board, so it was time to head down to the A gates, or the domestic A gates, to prepare to board our British Airways Airbus up to Glasgow. And on British Airways, European and domestic, you sort of know what you get. A fairly comfortable leather seat on an Airbus on a short haul flight.
Don't run away from me. Run away, please stay. I promise I'll never leave.
And as we taxi on to runway 27 right at Heathrow, here is a very rare sight. A British Airways 747-400 painted in retro style BOAC, celebrating 100 years of British Airways. After getting no sleep on the flight from New York the night before, I have to admit I slept most of the journey up to Glasgow, waking up as we started our approach into runway 23. Pulling on to stand 19 at Glasgow signalled the end of a pretty miserable journey back from New York to Glasgow via London Heathrow. And in May 2019, you're no longer welcome back to Glasgow by the famous grouse. Instead, Tenants has taken over this prime advertising location, reminding us all what is bad about British lager. And as we arrived at the taxi pickup point, we bumped into an old neighbour of ours, David Reynolds, who moved back to the south side of Glasgow a number of years ago with his family. And less than 40 minutes later, we were back in Strathaven, bringing New York at 50 to a close. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry that this video has ended up being a bit of a moan, and I know what you're thinking, that Graham and Fiona are used to flying Club World with British Airways, but you know what folks, before I could afford to fly Club, we used to fly economy all the time, but I can't help thinking that over the decades, British Airways Economy has simply got much worse. The challenge that we have living in Glasgow is we really don't have much of a choice. Of course we can fly to JFK through Schiphol with KLM or Lufthansa through Frankfurt, but you know what folks, the quickest way to get from Glasgow to JFK is still without a doubt with British Airways via Heathrow Terminal 5. So with the Virgin Atlantic acquisition of Flybe, we can only hope in the future that some competition will arrive and give British Airways a run for their money, because if that is the standard that BA wish to offer on their long haul economy, I'm sorry guys, I'm not going to endorse BA much longer, and our loyalty is without a doubt waning after that pretty miserable journey back from JFK to Glasgow via London. As it sits right now, Fiona and I have not booked a summer holiday. Our plan this year in 2019 is to book something last minute, so watch this space folks. In July we will book something lastminute.com to the Mediterranean, but where we don't know at this stage. So our next trip on British Airways will be back in the Club World cabin on a BA 777, this time to Antigua. But before I go, I know that I promised to paste in the unedited departure from JFK, so here it is folks, and again thanks for watching, and please remember to keep living the dream.
I'm
Walking alone, the streets are empty. The only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Yeah. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Feeling like a dynamite, ready to explode right up in the sky. I need you to listen, I need you to hear, and don't show any fear. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Yeah. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. From town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul.